And no one has given me a satisfactory explanation of why it is called the father of terror in Arabic. In the more ancient indigenous Egyptian language, it was called the Ark-Ur. And that is really interesting because as we've probed into the etymology, Ark-Ur meant the end of the beginning connected to the beginning of the end, almost like a cycle, like an endpoint, like a constant process, as if it represents the end of something and the beginning of something else. I'll tell you a story of courage by a guy named John Anthony West. John West is a rogue Egyptologist, if you will. He is a writer, raconteur, lecturer, but mostly John has been looking for the last 15 years or so at this object, much as I've been looking at its potential counterpoint on Mars. And he basically has been asking the question, did the Egyptians, in fact, as we know them, do this remarkable structure? Did they create the Sphinx and all that it implies? The canonical wisdom is that a pharaoh in the 4th dynasty, Old Kingdom, named Khephren, sculpted this being to mimic his own face, set up temples and worship and processes all around it to basically glorify his own dynastic reign. But John, in looking at the weathering, which was drawn to his attention by a gentleman named Schwaller de Lubitz, see, John, I do remember those things, noticed that there was an anomaly here that his contemporary reading of Egyptology simply could not explain. That is, the Sphinx appears to be much, much more heavily weathered than we have any right to expect from only, quote, 5,000 years of desert weathering. Because de Lubitz pointed out that the kind of weathering we see on the Sphinx is best explained by the action of running water. And it was John's immediate thought, water? In a desert? John tried for 15 years to bring actual hard geologists to the study of this profound puzzle, this enigma, this problem. And finally, in the form of Dr. Robert Schoch, who is a tenured professor of geology at the University, Boston University, he found an appropriately open-minded scientist who now has traveled to Egypt, what, 3 times? And has made measurements, been allowed in to make measurements with colleagues, people like Boris Said, who was pounding on a seismograph for a seismologist who was making electronic recordings. And the bottom line is, presented at the GSA conference last year and recently at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Chicago a few weeks ago, is this quote by Robert Schoch. The pyramid, not the pyramid, the Sphinx outside the pyramid is probably at least twice as old as anyone has ever dared to dream before. Now, that sounds like a relatively minor adjustment in a time scale on a structure that's 6,000 miles away, so who cares? I'll tell you one group who cares. It's the people who write for Jeopardy. The other night on Jeopardy, there was a question, what old monument has recently been dated to twice its former age? And the correct answer was the Sphinx. Unfortunately, they didn't mention John's name, but they will, okay? Because without John, you wouldn't have Bob Schoch involved, and without Schoch, you wouldn't have the scientists, the geologists now looking at it and saying, well, God, it's obvious. You need rain to get that degree of erosion, and you haven't really seen the real erosion, which is down in the cut on the back. 12 feet of it in some places. And that amount of rain has not fallen in Egypt for at least 10, maybe 15 or 20,000 years. Now that raises a profound and wonderful problem. It has the Egyptologists all frothing, you've got to understand. I mean, they're really frothing at this. I won't go into the skullduggery that is, you know, they've had some things go on that are not really what you expect out of the hallowed halls of academia. But the other fallout is that it means that we're now looking at a structure, a magnificent, monumental work of art created at a time when nobody else on planet Earth is supposedly able to do anything of that magnitude or scale. There's no other contemporary civilization to pin it on. So who did it? And before you say Martians, just sit there and listen, okay? Okay, I don't want you to leap here. Science has now opened I mean, rigorous science has opened the doorway to what, in I think it was John's parlance, the dreaded A word, Atlantis. Is it conceivable that the mythos that came down to us through Plato, speaking of a prior high civilization capable of things like this, is maybe not a myth, but in fact we're seeing at least one surviving, albeit very ancient, artifact that you can touch of that halcyon day when we could do things that we no longer can do, or at least that the Egyptians could not do. Again, we don't know, but the science possibilities are there, and they are now being very assiduously followed up by John and his team, and we'll come back in a year or two and we'll report the results. But this opened up, at least politically, the idea that maybe this glimmering resemblance between the face on Mars and the Sphinx was not just whistling Dixie. That maybe there might be a, if not physical link, at least a cultural passing connection. Something ineffable brushed an earlier phase of human history and left a monument that recorded in some form the echo of that signal. So when we look at the geometry of the monuments of Mars, and we look specifically at the latitude of the DNM, 40.9, and we see that it's E prime, which is the tetrahedral E, divided by pi equals 0.866, all right, which is the front of it, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible we can find a mathematical link, a verifiable, testable link between what we see here and Giza? And the answer is that, in fact, this thing is located about 30 degrees north, and the cosine of 30 north is equivalent to the tangent of 40.868. So, yes, there is a link. There's a mathematical link, the tangent of one and the cosine of the other. And that was kind of interesting. It was certainly more than we had before, but conclusive? Of course not. So, it got us out of thinking. Now you can see this really severe erosion, okay, on the back of it, and you're not seeing the ditch yet. Out in front of the, this is the Great Pyramid here. There's another one here called Kephren, and then one called Mycerinus, and three little guys here, and three little guys over here. What you need to do is you need to look at an overview to get the plan, all right? Here's the Sphinx, here's the Great Pyramid, Kephren Pyramid, Mycerinus, all right? And here's north. Errol Torin was the one to discover this. If you lay an Archimedean spiral, which is a version of that equiangular spiral that we have on Mars, on the Tholus, if you lay it such that each of these guys falls on it, all right, the point of it is right here in the desert, and there's nothing there, all right?